Nobody warned you about the quiet. Not the peaceful quiet you read about in spiritual books, a different kind. The kind that arrives once the burning is done, once the visions stop, once the synchronicities slow to almost nothing, and you're left in a version of your life that looks suspiciously like the one you had before, except everything inside you is different, and nothing on the outside reflects it. You went through the awakening, you did the work, something cracked open in you, sometimes violently, and for a long stretch of time the inner world was loud, full of insight, full of revelation, full of the unmistakable sense that you were being moved by something larger than yourself. And then, without announcement, it ended. Not in a triumphant arrival, not in some final breakthrough you could put on a shelf. It just settled. The fire went out. The voice that had been narrating your transformation went silent. And you've been trying ever since to figure out whether something is wrong with you, or whether this strange flatness is what the books forgot to mention. Carl Jung saw this exact period in his patients again and again, and it disturbed him how poorly it was understood. He watched people emerge from the most profound psychological transformations of their lives, only to enter a phase nobody had prepared them for, the phase after. The phase where the work has done its work, where the dramatic part is over, and where the real, strange, irreversible business of living as the changed person begins. Today, I want to walk you through what Jung discovered about this period, the specific things that happen to people on the other side of awakening, why they feel so disorienting, and why the strangeness you're experiencing isn't a sign that something went wrong. It's evidence that something actually completed. And almost nobody who reaches this place is told what to expect, which is why so many people quietly conclude they failed at the very moment they finished. The first strange thing, and this catches almost everyone off guard, is that the urgency disappears. For months, maybe years, you lived inside a kind of psychological emergency. Every dream felt important. Every coincidence felt meaningful. Every book you picked up seemed to contain the next piece of the puzzle. You were on a mission, and the mission was you. The intensity of it was exhausting and intoxicating in equal measure, and even when it was painful, there was a strange relief in knowing that something was happening, that you were moving, that you were becoming. And then one morning, the urgency just isn't there. You don't feel pulled toward anything in particular. The book that would have consumed you 6 months ago barely holds your attention now. The teacher whose every word felt like a personal message suddenly sounds like a person talking. You're not against any of it. You just don't need it the way you needed it before. And in the absence of that need, there's a quiet that you don't quite know what to do with. Jung observed this drop-off in patients who had completed what he called a major individuation cycle. The psyche, he said, doesn't operate at peak intensity indefinitely. It mobilizes enormous energy when transformation is required, and then withdraws that energy once the work is essentially done. What feels like spiritual flatness is actually the return of normal psychological functioning after a long period of extraordinary mobilization. Your system is doing what it's supposed to do. It's standing down. But the ego doesn't know this. The ego has gotten used to the intensity. It learned to identify with the seeker, the awakener, the one in process. And when the process completes, the ego goes looking for the next crisis, the next breakthrough, the next dramatic revelation, because that's what it knows how to do. It thinks the absence of intensity means something is wrong. It starts manufacturing problems just to have something to work on. Or it falls into a kind of soft despair, convinced that the real spiritual life has somehow slipped away. What's actually happened is more interesting. You've moved into what Jung described as the integration phase, and integration looks nothing like awakening. Awakening is fireworks. Integration is the slow, almost invisible work of letting the new structure settle into the bones of your daily life. It happens underneath conscious awareness. It happens while you're doing dishes. It happens in the spaces between thoughts. And because it's not dramatic, the ego dismisses it as nothing. But the integration is where the awakening actually becomes you. The second strange thing is that you start losing interest in spiritual content. This one feels almost shameful when it begins, because for a long time, spiritual material was your lifeline. The teachers, the books, the videos, they oriented you. They named what you were experiencing. They made you feel less alone. and now you can barely make it through a chapter. The language that used to crack you open sounds rehearsed. The concepts you used to underline sound like things people say. You're not skeptical exactly, you're just done in some way you can't articulate. Jung would have recognized this as a healthy sign, a sign that the inner authority you were building during the awakening has actually taken hold. While the work was happening, you needed outer voices to confirm your inner experience. You needed the maps because you didn't yet trust your own sense of the terrain. But at some point, if the work goes well, the maps become unnecessary. Not because you've surpassed them, but because the territory they describe has become familiar enough that you're walking it without checking the page. This loss of interest can be lonely, though, because it often comes with a quiet separation from communities that used to feel like home. The forums, the workshops, the conversations with people who were also in process, they start to feel like a phase you've passed through. You don't want to look down on the people still in it. You remember being there, but you can't perform the language of seeking anymore without feeling like you're lying. And there isn't really a new community for people who have stopped seeking, because the people who have stopped seeking are usually just quietly living somewhere, doing ordinary things, not announcing themselves. The third strange thing, and this is the one Jung found most psychologically significant, is the return of ordinary desires. For a long time during the awakening, you may have transcended a lot of what used to drive you. Status didn't matter, money felt small. Old ambitions seemed like artifacts of who you used to be. There was a freedom in this, and also a kind of moral cleanliness. You were above all the things that kept regular people stuck. And then, gradually, you noticed something uncomfortable. Some of those old desires came back. Not with the same grip they used to have, but they came back. You found yourself caring about your work again. You found yourself wanting things, recognition, comfort, security, even pleasure, that you thought you had outgrown. And the spiritual ego in you tried to interpret this as backsliding, as falling from grace, as evidence that the awakening hadn't really stuck. Jung would have told you the opposite. The return of ordinary desires is what wholeness actually looks like. The awakening period required you to disidentify from your normal humanity for a while, to step back from your ego, your appetites, your social self, your ambitions, in order to see them clearly. But you weren't meant to live there permanently. You were meant to return. And the version of you that returns gets to engage with desire differently. The ambition is there, but it doesn't run you. The appetite is there, but it doesn't blind you. You're a full human being again, just one who is seen behind the curtain and can't unsee it. The transcendence phase was never the goal. The goal was always integration, being able to live a normal human life with abnormal psychological depth running underneath it. Jung was emphatic on this point. The truly individuated person doesn't float above the world. They're more in it than most people, because they've stopped fighting the parts of life they used to consider beneath them. The fourth strange thing is that you start to grieve who you were during the awakening. This one is harder to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. The awakening period was often agonizing while you were in it, disorienting, lonely, full of fear and uncertainty. But there was also something about it that felt extraordinarily alive. You were close to something. You could feel the larger forces moving. There was meaning in everything because everything felt charged with significance. And now, in the after period, that charge is gone. The ordinary world is ordinary again. The trees are trees. The conversations are conversations. There's no longer a hidden current running underneath everything that you can feel if you tune in carefully enough. And there's a quiet mourning that comes with this. You miss the person who was being transformed. You miss the intimacy with the unconscious. You miss feeling chosen by something. If you've been feeling this, the strange ache of having completed something that no longer holds the meaning it once did, you might find some company in our guide, True Self-Discovery. 24 reflection exercises built around Jung's framework for exactly this kind of in-between place, where the dramatic part of the work is over and the quiet part is still finding its shape. The link is right below this video. The exercises are designed for people who don't need to be opened anymore. They need to be settled. They need a way to listen to what the quiet is saying, because the quiet is saying something. That's the fifth strange thing, and the one that often takes the longest to recognize. The voice that used to roar through your awakening has shifted to a register so subtle that most people miss it. It's still speaking, but it's speaking quietly now, in a way that requires a different kind of attention. During the awakening, the unconscious had to shout to be heard. Your conscious mind was so identified with the old structure that nothing short of dramatic intervention could break through. Vivid dreams, visions, synchronicities, emotional eruptions. The inner world had to use everything in its arsenal to get your attention, and once it had your attention, it had to keep it long enough to do the work. But once you and the unconscious have established a relationship, once the bridge has been built and the basic reorientation has happened, the communication softens. It doesn't need to be loud anymore. You're listening now. So the voice becomes the slight feeling in your stomach when someone is lying to you. The quiet pull toward one option over another in a decision that has no logical answer. The small instinct that makes you cancel plans you should have kept, or stay home on a day you were supposed to travel, and you find out later why. Jung described this as the integration of the transcendent function. During the awakening, the function was working overtime, generating dramatic content to bridge the conscious and unconscious. After the awakening, the function is still active, but it's running in the background, embedded in ordinary perception. You don't need visions anymore to know what your psyche thinks. You know in your body. You know in the way you move through your day. The knowing has become so integrated that it stops feeling like spiritual experience and starts feeling like common sense, which is exactly why people miss it. A lot of post-awakening people start doubting whether the awakening was real, because they can no longer point to dramatic evidence of it in their daily life. The voice doesn't roar, the signs don't flash. There's no dramatic confirmation that they're still in contact with whatever moved them. And in the absence of that confirmation, the ego whispers that maybe the whole thing was an episode. Maybe they imagined it. Maybe they're just an ordinary person who had a weird couple of years. The sixth strange thing is the way your old relationships shift again, but differently than they did during the awakening. During the awakening, relationships often collapsed. People couldn't follow where you were going. Friendships ended. Some family members became strangers. Romantic partnerships dissolved or transformed beyond recognition. That phase had a clarity to it, even though it was painful. You could see what was happening. You were changing, and the relationships that couldn't change with you fell away. After the awakening, something subtler happens. You start to see, with painful clarity, that some of the relationships that survived the awakening only survived because you were still performing pieces of your old self around them. You'd kept some compartments intact during the storm. And now, in the quiet, those compartments are dissolving too, because there's no energy left to maintain them. You can't fake interest in conversations that don't actually interest you anymore. You can't pretend to care about dynamics that you've outgrown. The performance has become impossible, not through some dramatic stand, but through a simple lack of fuel. And here's the difficult part. The people in those relationships often don't understand what's happening. During the awakening, your distance could be explained. You were going through something. Now you're not going through anything, technically, and yet you're more distant than ever. There's nothing to point to, no story that makes sense of it, just the gradual recognition, on both sides, that something has thinned between you. Jung saw this constantly in patients who had completed major individuation work. The relationships that endured were the ones built on genuine recognition, on the capacity to meet the person you'd become rather than the person they'd known. Everything else, slowly, quietly, finished. The seventh strange thing is harder to put into words because it touches the texture of consciousness itself. After the awakening, you begin to notice that joy and pain have both gone slightly quiet. The highs aren't as high, the lows aren't as low. The big emotions are still available, but they don't run you the way they used to. And this can feel at first like a kind of deadness, like you've lost the ability to feel deeply, like the awakening took your capacity for emotional intensity along with everything else it took. But if you sit with it long enough, you start to recognize that this isn't deadness. It's something more like spaciousness. The emotions still arise, but they arise in a larger field of awareness, and they don't occupy the entire field anymore. You can be sad without becoming sadness. You can be joyful without losing yourself in joy. There's a witness that wasn't there before. Or rather, there's a witness that was always there but is now consistently present. Jung described this as the establishment of the ego-self axis, a permanent connection between your conscious sense of self and the deeper center of the psyche. Once that axis is established, your relationship to your own emotions changes. They become weather rather than climate. They move through. They don't define. And what feels like flatness at first gradually reveals itself as a far more stable kind of richness than the volatility you used to mistake for being fully alive. The eighth strange thing is the relationship you develop with time. During the awakening, time often felt distorted, sometimes glacial, sometimes accelerated, but rarely ordinary. The intensity of inner experience compressed or stretched the days in strange ways, and you often had the sense of operating on a different clock than the people around you. After the awakening, time becomes ordinary again, but you relate to it differently. The future feels less like something to chase. The past feels less like something to repair. You spend more time in the present, not because you're practicing some technique, but because there's simply less psychological pressure pulling you elsewhere. The mind has stopped working so hard. The unfinished business that used to drag you into past or future has, for the most part, been finished, or you've made peace with the parts that can't be. This shift can look, from the outside, like a loss of ambition. People might say you've changed. You used to be more driven. You used to care about things. They're not wrong, exactly. You used to care about a lot of things that you no longer care about, and you don't have a good way to explain why those things have lost their hold on you without sounding either spiritual or smug. So mostly, you just say nothing. You let people interpret you however they need to, and you go on living the quieter life that has somehow become yours without your quite deciding it. The ninth strange thing, and this one Jung found particularly important, is the disappearance of the seeker identity. For a long time, you were someone in the process of becoming. You were a person on a path. You had a story about your own development, and that story gave you a way to organize your sense of self. Even when the awakening was painful, the identity of being someone awakening gave you something to hold on to. After the awakening, that identity dissolves, and there's nothing dramatic to replace it. You're not awakened exactly. You don't feel like you've arrived anywhere. You're just you, without a title, without a story arc, without a sense of where you are in your own development. The narrative that gave shape to your inner life for years has quietly ended, and you're sitting in the strange experience of being a person without a project. This is the part Jung considered most psychologically demanding, because the ego has nothing to grab onto. There's no goal, no identity, no path forward that you can name. Just the daily fact of being yourself, doing whatever life asks of you, without any larger story arc to make sense of it. And the temptation to manufacture a new story, to declare yourself a teacher, a healer, a someone with something to offer, can be enormous. Because at least teaching would be a project. At least helping others would give you a role. Jung warned against this premature crystallization. He'd watched too many post-awakening people skip the silent period by rushing into a new identity, and he saw what it cost them. The integration that should have continued for years got cut short by the need to become something. The depth that should have continued to settle got performed instead of lived. They ended up reproducing the same surface-level spirituality they had originally awakened out of, just with themselves as the teacher this time. The people who could tolerate the identitylessness, who could be no one in particular for as long as the no-oneness lasted, developed something Jung considered far more valuable than any spiritual identity could ever be. He called it the lived sense of the self, a felt presence of being rooted in something deeper than any role, story, or accomplishment, available in ordinary moments, doing ordinary things, with no announcement and no audience. The 10th strange thing is that you stop trying to figure out what your awakening was for. During the process, you probably had moments where you wondered what all of it was leading to. What was your purpose? What was the mission? What were you being prepared for? The awakening felt so significant that surely it was pointing towards something, some destiny, some calling, some great work you were meant to undertake. After the awakening, that question loses its urgency, not because you found the answer, because the question itself starts to feel like the wrong question. The awakening wasn't preparing you for anything in particular. It was simply allowing you to become who you actually are, so that whatever you do with your life from this point forward can be yours rather than borrowed. The purpose was never some future achievement. The purpose was the becoming itself. This is hard to accept for people who were sold a more grandiose version of awakening, one that promised a unique mission, a special role, a destiny that would announce itself once you'd done the inner work. Jung saw the spiritual marketplace selling this version aggressively, and he watched countless post-awakening people exhaust themselves trying to find the special mission that was supposed to justify everything they'd been through. The truth he kept returning to was less dramatic and far more freeing. There's no mission you have to find. There's just the life in front of you, the relationships you're actually in, the work that's already yours to do. The awakening hasn't been preparing you for something extraordinary. It's been preparing you to meet the ordinary with extraordinary depth. And once you can accept that, the pressure to find your purpose dissolves, and you start noticing that the purpose has been quietly assembling itself in the small choices you've been making since the dust settled. If you're somewhere in this strange after period, past the fireworks, not yet at home in the quiet, the work isn't done. It's just changed shape. True self-discovery is built for this exact stretch. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's framework, designed for people who don't need another opening, but who need a way to listen to what's been quietly arriving since the opening closed. The link is below. The last strange thing, and Jung considered it the surest sign that an awakening had genuinely completed, is that you start being able to live among ordinary people again without resentment, condescension, or the constant need to differentiate yourself from them. During the awakening, you may have spent a lot of energy on the felt difference between you and the unawakened world. There was a we and they quality to your experience. The people who got it, the people who didn't, the ones who could meet you in your depth, the ones who never could. After the awakening completes, that distinction gets quieter. You start noticing that the people you used to consider asleep are doing their own work, in ways that don't look like spiritual work but are still real. The neighbor, raising her children with patience she didn't have a year ago. The coworker who finally left the marriage that was killing him. The aunt who started telling the truth at family gatherings after decades of keeping the peace. None of them would call themselves awakened. None of them have read the books or done the retreats. And yet, in their own way, on their own timeline, they're individuating too. The process doesn't require spiritual language. It doesn't even require self-awareness about itself. It just requires that life keeps applying pressure, and that the person keeps responding to the pressure honestly enough. Jung found this recognition to be one of the most important fruits of completed inner work. The hierarchy of awakened versus asleep stops feeling true. The us and them collapses into a quieter perception. Everyone is somewhere in this process, whether they know it or not, and the people who think they're ahead are often the ones who've gotten the most stuck in self-image. The truly post-awakening person stops feeling separate from regular humanity and starts feeling, often for the first time, genuinely part of it. This is what the quiet has been building toward this whole time, not a higher version of you, a more grounded one who can be in a room full of people without needing to be the deepest person there, one who can engage with ordinary life without having to add spiritual meaning to every interaction. One who can disappear into a normal day and find that the normalcy is itself the texture of a life that's finally yours. And here's what Jung would want you to know if you're sitting in the strange aftermath right now, wondering whether something is wrong, wondering whether you should be doing more, wondering whether the awakening even meant anything since it left you in such an ordinary-looking place. The ordinariness is the meaning. The awakening was never going to deliver you to a more extraordinary life. It was going to deliver you to your actual life, the one underneath all the performance, the one you couldn't quite reach because of all the structures you had to dismantle to get here. You've gotten here. The strange flatness is the texture of having arrived. The quiet is the sound of a psyche that doesn't need to broadcast anymore because you're finally listening. The disappearance of the seeker identity is what it feels like to no longer need to seek. The return of ordinary desires is what it looks like to be a full human being again, just one with depth running underneath every ordinary thing you do. Nobody warned you about the quiet because the people selling awakening don't know what to do with this part of the story. It doesn't market well. It doesn't make for a dramatic post. It doesn't translate into a workshop you can sell. But it's where the actual life is. It's where everything you went through finally pays off. Not in fireworks, but in the steady, unannounced fact of being yourself, doing your life, with a center of gravity that nothing external can shake. The awakening ended. That's not a loss. That's the work having done what it came to do. And the strange things happening now, the silence, the disinterest in what used to consume you, the return of normal desires, the loss of the seeker identity, the quiet rejoining of ordinary humanity, all of them are the same thing wearing different clothes. They're the integration completing itself. They're the new self moving into the rooms of your old life and quietly putting things in order. They're you, finally, without the project of becoming yourself running in the background. Stay in the quiet. Don't manufacture a new awakening just because the old one ended. Don't grab a new identity just because the seeker one dissolved. Don't go looking for a mission just because the silence makes you nervous. The life that's emerging from this strange afterward is the life Jung spent his career trying to describe. A life lived from the self, not for the ego, not against the world, just here, in this body, in this day, doing what's actually in front of you. That's the gold the alchemists were chasing. And the strangest thing of all, the thing nobody could have prepared you for, is that it doesn't look like gold. It looks like an ordinary Tuesday, lived by someone who finally knows who they are. If you haven't yet, take a look at True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, built for the quiet phase after the dramatic phase ends. A way to keep listening as the integration continues to settle into the bones of your daily life. The link is right below.